Yeah, I think some of the things you've raised, I'd need to go to my books for a week before I could be bold enough to open my mouth. I'll open my mouth and see what comes out. I'm not sure what is going to come out. We'll just see what happens. I think if I can start with a word about critical scholars and just explain something about what has been going on in the Christian world, Christian in inverted commas, the one-time Christian world for the last almost 200 years. The onset of the Enlightenment, rebellion against the church and the authority of the church, led to a movement in the universities of Europe to try to, well, I'll use your word, deconstruct Christianity, deconstruct the Old Testament, deconstruct the Gospels. And in the end, very little is left. You can find a scholar who will raise doubts about anything you want to. And I think if we follow that path, we need to beware that Islam itself will not escape. That once you start down the road of deconstruction, now what do we mean by deconstruction? You take a story which has a meaning which anybody can read, and you look for little details in the story that perhaps arouse suspicion, and in the end you've got nothing left. You've done what you've said, you've deconstructed it. And well, Shabir, you've gone down that road, and I wonder whether that's really what you want to do in the end to the Gospels. Because what you're left with, I take it that the Gospels mean something to you as Muslims, not just to us as Christians. They are the only source we have of knowledge about the life of Jesus. If we deconstruct them, know that we're following the methods of secularists, of materialists, of enemies of God. And where do we end up? You quoted one, I know who it was now, it was Raymond Brown, wasn't it, the man who's written lots on the Gospel of John. Interesting case here, because here you've got a Roman Catholic scholar. Roman Catholic scholars traditionally have been extremely conservative. They've resisted this kind of this corrosion of modern secularism, but Raymond Brown has kind of capitulated to it, and he's going down that road. Now, Raymond Brown looks at the narrative of John's Gospel. He sees a possible motive for John to make up a story about a soldier thrusting a spear into Jesus' side. And once he's discovered a possible motive, he says, well, that's what it must have been. Then John made it up. He made it up to suit his own particular apologetic theological purpose. So what am I to do with that? What am I to do when I have the Gospel of John before me, a writing of a man who says he was there, and this is what he saw. And now I've got a scholar 2,000 years later who says, I don't believe it, I don't think that happened. In the end, you're faced with a question, a personal question: who am I going to believe? Who am I going to believe? And it's hard to escape from that kind of quandary. Now, it brings me to say something about the character of the New Testament writings, particularly the Gospels. They are what I would call witness. They are witness. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, each of them testifying to what they know. Now, they don't all claim to be eyewitnesses. Luke says he's not an eyewitness. He says he's carefully collected the information from those who were eyewitnesses. He had a beautiful opportunity to do it. He went with Paul to Jerusalem on that last journey to Jerusalem. Paul was arrested. He spent 18 months in prison in Caesarea, and Luke was free and at large to meet and to interview all of the early Christian leaders in Jerusalem and in Galilee. And on the basis of his researches, he gives us the story as he sees it. Now, I just don't think we can get past the fact that we have these four, and I need to ask this question to you really, because as I'm listening to you, I'm wondering, and I don't think what I'm hearing is really the truth. Do you think these men deliberately set out to deceive? You have four men who give you the story behind them. Of course, they have communities and everything else. What we have in the New Testament is witness, and it's not the witness of one person. It's not one person saying, I saw something, I heard something, and here it is, and there's no corroboration of that. You have four witnesses, and behind them, many other witnesses. I mean, let me just take one example. The people on the road to Emmaus. Luke tells that story. He's the only one who tells the story. And he gives us the name of the man, Cleopas. Now, he gives us the name of the person because that name will mean something to some of the people that he's writing to. Usually they don't tell you the names of the players. Most of the players in the Gospels are anonymous, but every now and again a name turns up. Why does it turn up? I mean, Simon of Cyrene, who was forced to carry Jesus' cross on the way to the place of crucifixion, and Mark tells us that he was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, who were Alexander and Rufus? We've got reason to think that they were known Christians within the Roman Church whose father was caught up in events accidentally at that time. There are people who are identified who you can actually go and you can say, did this really happen or not? At least people in the first century could do that. That's why Paul says he appeared to 500, most of whom are alive. That means you can go and talk to them. Now, you can deconstruct these stories. You can, it seems to me that what the disciples experienced on that first day of Easter and the days following was something so fantastic, something so outside of their expectations, something so impossible, and I'll say something supernatural, that I don't think it's surprising that in the narratives you find these expressions of doubt. I mean, I'm just looking at Matthew. I think it's really a question of translation. It's not a question of text. I don't see any textual variation there. Perhaps you could translate it, they doubted. So what is Matthew saying? He's saying they saw him, they believe, and they doubted at the same time. Wouldn't you if you were confronted with a man who just before was dead? Or the way I would translate it, and the way most translations have it, is that they worshipped him. Well, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Wouldn't you expect that in a situation like that, where they see him alive after he's dead, they realise that he's no other than the Lord God Almighty who has visited his people, that some of them will doubt. It seems to me that what we're reading is the honest but it's the honest, account of a man who, for everything that he expresses, is absolutely convinced that Jesus is alive from the dead, that he died and rose from the dead. And you've got Matthew, you've got Mark, you've got Luke, you've got John. You've got James, who was the leader of the church in Jerusalem at that time. You've got the women. Mary Magdalene was a very well-known woman in those days. She didn't die a week after Jesus' ascension. She was around. People could talk to her. Her witness is there embedded in the account. And it's an interesting exercise. Take the four Gospels and look at them. Shabir is perfectly correct that Mark is the first Gospel. At least not everybody agrees with that, but I think he and I agree on that. And also that Matthew and Luke utilised Mark when they wrote their own Gospels. Why did they do that? They did that because Mark's Gospel is essentially the witness of Peter. It's Peter who stands behind it. It's Peter's stories about Jesus, what he saw, that Mark, who was a young, educated person who could write in Jerusalem, wrote those stories down. So there you've got basically Peter's Gospel. And it had enormous authority because of that. And when Luke took up his pen, he wasn't about to make a completely new... He takes the Gospel of... frustrated because the Gospel of Mark contains so little of the teaching of Jesus. And so he doubles the length of Mark, mostly with the teaching of Jesus. Now, did he make that teaching up? No, these men lived in the first generation. They lived at a time when hundreds of people who had seen Jesus and had listened to him were telling his story. There was a lot of material to gather. Well, no, that'll take me down a side road. Yeah, so it seems to me, yeah, you can deconstruct, but basically, in the end, you'll have to make that decision. Am I going to believe John, who was there, who was the friend of Jesus, and says this, or am I going to believe Raymond Brown? And that could be multiplied 1,000 times over with some of the... I mean, every time a guy wants to do a PhD in biblical studies, let me tell you this. To do a PhD, you've got to say something new. What's the easiest way to say something new? Take something that's always been believed, take something that's there in the book, and deconstruct it, and then you've got your PhD, and that is going on all around us all the time. Wait till they start doing it to the Qur'an. Not, brothers and sisters, I'm not wishing that on you, but that's been upon us for the last 200 years. I'm blank. Maybe I'll surrender at that point.
2 minutes.
No, I'll surrender. Give my 2 minutes to Shabir.
Thank you, David, for that very engaging response. Now, to deal with some of the points that have been raised here tonight, let me start at the end. Think about what is involved in deconstructing. Well, of course, we have inherited a lot of material from ancient history and from medieval times. We cannot believe everything we read, but we ask ourselves, what makes sense and what doesn't make sense? What seems to fit with whatever else we happen to know? A Muslim here has a choice either to believe the Qur'an or to reject the Qur'an. And if we start with the Qur'an, we have a verse which tells us something about what happened with Jesus. Jesus was exalted by God. Crucifixion did not happen. Well, the Muslim believes that on the grounds that this is the Word of God presented to us by the Almighty God. Human beings may be wrong, but God is always right. But if a Muslim is told, no, you shouldn't believe the Quran, believe some other narrative, then the Muslim naturally would want to be critical of any such narrative. And this is natural. Just as a Bible believer will hear the Quran and say, no, that cannot be right, because we know from the Bible that Jesus died and rose from the dead. How could the Quran say Jesus was not crucified? So a Christian may want to deconstruct the Quran. And this is legitimate in a dialogue such as this one. So naturally, a Muslim would want to find where the Bible is right, but also what causes the Bible to be so different from the Quranic narrative. And Muslims would naturally be attracted to those scholars who are critical of the Bible. But we must warn that a Muslim should not go out of his way to pick up materials from outside of the accepted biblical scholarship just because somebody said that something that is in your favor. We must go by the strictest standards of academic discourse here. Yes, people may get PhDs by coming up with some fringe thesis, but that there is a process of approval. He has to be approved by other PhDs. He has to sit before a council of scholars who know the field and who will reject some, you might say, some fringe thesis. Sometimes something does go under the wire, but it does not become the scholarship in the field. Scholars base their work on previous scholarship, and they accept some and they reject some. They disprove some previous PhDs. They prove that some people who got their PhDs have actually written something which is not based on a mistake, which is based on a mistake. So all of this happens, and eventually a sort of consensus in scholarship forms. And it is in that consensus that the average person can have some confidence. And we have seen that both David and I agree on mark and priority, and the idea that Luke and Matthew are both basing their narrative on Mark. This leads to some very important conclusions. We can see the manner in which Matthew and Luke have both improved on the story, as they were just basically copying Mark. They didn't just simply copy it, but they improved. And that leads us now to think that Mark in his own way might have improved what he received. And indeed, some scholars have made note of that, as we said. In Mark's source, scholars have posited there was no mention that Jesus appeared alive to his disciples after the crucifixion event. And now Mark has styled it such by introducing two verses, especially Mark chapter 16, verse 7, to indicate that Jesus will appear to his disciples. So there is an improvement in the story. We have seen that even if we go from the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to John eventually, John has improved the story as well. John has introduced the spear thrust. So finally we have something that one might hope would have killed Jesus. So you can see the motives of the writers. And by discovering these motives from the basic presuppositions which David and I start out with, it looks like we don't need to go to any ultra-critical or any scholar with a leaning that is outside of the scholarly consensus. So we are dealing here, yes, with enlightenment, but a positive feature of enlightenment in that it allows us to think carefully about what we believe. Now, what about if these same scholars turn around and say something critical about the Qur'an? Well, just as we have relied here, I have relied on top biblical scholars in the field, such as Raymond Brown, who has written massive works on the New Testament. His book on the death of the Messiah is in 2 volumes, packed with information that could actually cover several volumes if they are written in usual type sizes, and if he would actually spell out for the layperson what he's actually saying. But he's written in such a dense format that he could actually pack all of that information into the 2 volumes. A similar thing can be noticed in his 2-volume commentary on John's Gospel. When I debated my friend Joseph Smith in Leicester some years ago, he said, I'm quoting from something like the 1-volume commentary on the Bible. I should really be referring to Raymond Brown because he has written such a massive commentary on John's Gospel. So then I began referring to Raymond Brown. But you can see that there is no solution, because you might refer to a scholar once who is recommended by some other and not accepted by some other. But we must proceed. Raymond Brown is by far one of the most learned scholars in the field of biblical studies in our recent times. So naturally, using the same principle, if I'm going to turn to scholarship regarding the Quran, I would want to refer to scholars who are the top in the field of scholarship on the Quran. And there must be some criteria who are recognized as the top scholars in the field. And I do read these scholars, and I do have the opportunity to ask myself, are they saying something true, noteworthy? Are they saying something based on fact? Is it only a hypothetical sort of information? And I make my own mind about that. But if David feels that there is some scholarship that I have ignored and he would like to mention it, sure, I'd like to hear what it is. And perhaps if there's a book I haven't read, I'd be glad to read that book and then report my own conclusions regarding that book. But so far, I haven't heard anything presented tonight regarding that. And so we must leave it that I have referred to some of the most learned scholars in the field, and I've presented the information which they spoke about. So the spear thrust. Raymond Brown doesn't accept the spear thrust, but John accepts it, and John was there. First of all, it is highly disputed that John was actually there at the scene. Raymond Brown, again, but let me just mention someone else in case you have reservations about Raymond Brown. It is widely accepted in biblical scholarship that the 4th gospel, entitled The Gospel According to John, was not written by one of the disciples of Jesus and a person present there at the scene, despite the appearance semblance of this narrative which says that I was there, which says, or it's actually given in the second person, he who was there saw it and he reported it and so on. That semblance of veracity is actually doubted by biblical scholars. It is thought today that John's Gospel has gone through many stages to reach the final form in which we have it today, and the final form is due to a redactor who was not an eyewitness at the scene. So it's not that we want to believe Raymond Brown regarding the spear thrust, but think of the logic that I've presented to you. Who would want to spare Jesus after they have noticed the 3 hours of darkness throughout the land, and then the massive earthquake that tears apart the earth such that the curtain of the temple is torn in two from top to bottom? It would have to be somebody who didn't witness all of this, and that seems highly unlikely. So you have the first 3 Gospels reporting about these cosmic phenomena, and you have the 4th Gospel giving us the spear thrust. But no Gospel gives us both, because the 2 bits of information cannot coincide with each other. You either have the spear thrust, or you have the cosmic mourning for Jesus. But you can't have them both. And this is why John gives us one, and the other 3 Gospels give us the other one. And John's Gospel is the one that is thought to be extremely doubtful with regards to the spear thrust in particular. It's another matter whether anyone would accept the cosmic phenomena, but the spear thrust is thought to be an addition by John to the story. Was the reports about the appearance of Jesus from the dead based on deliberate deception? No, I don't believe so. I believe that the writers at the time were caught up with the kinds of storytelling that we know normally takes place in a society. Gossips and rumors and reports about what has happened and the spectacular nature of some of the reports. What are we to make, for example, of Matthew's Gospel? Matthew says that when the earth was split, even the rocks were split. And the bodies of the saints became alive. And after Jesus' resurrection, they came out of their tombs and they went into the city and appeared to many people. Now, this massive dawning of the dead, the resurrection of such a large number of people back from the dead, would be such a phenomenon that you would expect that everybody would make mention of it. Matthew is alone in mentioning that. Not the other Gospels, not the historians from the period. So is that a true narrative? Or is it something that came up as a rumor and Matthew just simply recorded it? I think the latter, and I don't think Matthew was being deceptive. He didn't intend to deceive anyone by saying that. He is just, as a writer in his time, writing down the common stories that appeal to him, and he puts it forward to us in a narrative that has the appearance of historicity, but that's because we treat it so. Now we understand what the Gospels are trying to do. They're not historical narratives. They are apologetic pieces and theological works to defend and promote a certain sort of belief using the stories and narratives that were available in the time when they were writing. I'm glad that David has agreed that they doubted is a possible translation, which would mean that all of the disciples doubted, despite the fact that the narrative says that they worship Jesus. But even if we agree with David and say that the preferred translation is that some doubted, we still have the question. Somebody appears to the disciples of Jesus.